Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It is good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. This week is set to be one of the most consequential in deciding the fate of President Biden's domestic agenda. Michigan Congresswoman Debbie Dingell was a bit more blunt in her take on the week ahead.
You want me to be honest? I'll tell you it's going to be the week from hell. But the fact of the matter is failure is not an option. There's too much at stake.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is already managing expectations. She postponed a planned Monday vote on infrastructure, and she says the price tag of President Biden's social and climate spending plan will need to come down again. The president originally called for $6 trillion of spending over the next 10 years. As negotiations continued, that was cut to $3.5 trillion. The vote delay is meant to give Democrats time to hash out their differences and then pass the two bills together. President Biden remained optimistic this afternoon when asked about what's at stake.
Victory is what's at stake. Well, it may not be by the end of the week. I hope it's by the end of the week. But as long as we're still alive, we got three things to do: the debt ceiling, continuing resolution, and the two pieces of legislation. If we do that, the country's going to be in great shape.
It comes as Senate Republicans are poised to block a bill that would keep the government running through December and stave off a looming debt default. It's not fully clear what happens after the Senate fails to raise the debt ceiling, but the White House says it's preparing for a possible government shutdown just 3 days from now. Let's bring in Skyler Henry, Natalie Jennings, and Sarah Westwood. Skyler covers Congress and the White House for CBS News. Natalie is a deputy Washington editor for the Washington Post, and Sarah is a political and investigative reporter for the Washington Examiner. Welcome to you all. Happy Monday. Natalie, let me start with you. Democratic leaders seem caught between Republicans holding firm on the debt ceiling and progressives wanting a massive social spending increase. Is it clear what concessions may be made to get legislation passed?
That is the hard thing. They do know at least that they're not going to be getting any Republican votes on raising the debt ceiling. We're almost assured of that. We'll see in a little bit later this evening. And then the massive spending bill that contains a lot of the priorities that President Biden ran on are the ones that are really going to be squeezed in the negotiations over the next couple of days that determine whether Pelosi and Schumer feel like they can bring this to a vote. And so things like climate policy, taxing on people with higher incomes, all those things that liberals really want are things that are starting to make some moderates squeamish, yet moderates still really want this bipartisan infrastructure bill to go through. And so there's a lot of differences that, it's very hard to see how they're going to be reconciled, but it always is hard to see that until it comes down to the end. And we are getting down really to the wire this week.
Absolutely. Well, Skyler, we mentioned Speaker Pelosi's delaying of the infrastructure vote. Will the president be part of shoring up Democratic support ahead of Thursday?
Well, he certainly said that he would be. When he was getting his booster shot earlier today, he was asked about that, and he said that he would be participating in phone calls with key legislators later this evening and early tomorrow, just to try to shore up more Democratic support for his focal point in terms of his agenda, really. And I think that that's what you're starting to see from some of the senior Democrats within the party as well. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi meeting with other Democrats later this evening to try to get more buy-in, if you will. We've already seen some of the progressives, as you and Natalie just talked about, say that they won't do the infrastructure package or vote on that without seeing that $3.5 trillion plan first. And so I think what you're going to see now is President Biden perhaps start to make even more phone calls. We know in the past few weeks he's reached out to some of the moderate senators, Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, for example, to try to get them to try to buy into his plan. When asked about what those two were demanding, so to speak, in terms of a price tag, Jen Psaki, the press secretary for the White House, didn't necessarily go into details. She said that she wouldn't feel comfortable talking about what the two sides necessarily wanted, but again said that the president would be leaning into his 36 years of experience as a senator, 8 as a vice president, in terms of his negotiation skills to try to get more buy-in for his plan, because as you well know, it is so important to get all Democrats on board, particularly in the House, with those slim margins that they have.
So important and so incredibly difficult, as we've seen play out. Well, Natalie, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell told the Washington Post he is not bluffing on the debt ceiling. He is telling Republicans to not increase it no matter the consequences. Has his position been consistent?
Well, it has over this particular fight over the debt ceiling, but there's some inconsistencies kind of at the heart of it, which is that this is to cover spending that has already been incurred. So a lot of it that was incurred under President Trump or in the coronavirus legislation, the relief legislation that was passed. I think the framing of the argument often from Republicans and his caucus and what they're using now, and I should say they are all pretty unified. McConnell's leading the way, but he so far is keeping his caucus with them, saying that if Democrats want to pass these big spending bills, then they need to not they can go ahead and also fix this debt limit on their own, ignoring that kind of this is spending that's already happened. They're tying these things together. But all along, McConnell has said he's going to do this. And as it comes up to the date to do it, yes, he is being consistent and actually looks like he's going to vote the way he says he is.
Well, Sarah, as this consequential week kicks off, Republicans are releasing ads tying 17 vulnerable Democrats to the president and spending. Are they banking on failure prematurely?
Well, there are dwindling incentives for those moderates to go ahead and support the big reconciliation bill. And I think Republicans are sensing an opening here. They can either use their vote, the vulnerable House Democrats' vote on the reconciliation bill as a weapon in the midterms, or they can prevent Democrats from having enough votes to get it over the finish line in the first place by applying that pressure now. And that's what we're seeing the NRCC do. And for those House Democrats, President Biden doesn't have the popularity that he did when he first set about promoting this piece of legislation. There's not as much benefit for them in handing him a win and tying themselves so closely to the Biden agenda as it polls worse and worse. The price tag of the bill and some of the more liberal elements of it are not polling well with independents and with the centrist voters that those vulnerable House Democrats will need to stay in office. And so from their perspective, they've obviously got to be sweating as Speaker Pelosi is trying to push this massive piece of legislation through the House without the kind of consensus that something this large would really require, and ignoring their desires when it comes to the bipartisan infrastructure package, which they wanted to put on the House floor first. And she has continued to brush those concerns aside. So from their perspective, there are less and less reasons to get behind the reconciliation bill, and Republicans are really sensing that vulnerability and taking advantage of it.
Well, Skyler, how real is the threat of the U.S. government defaulting on its debt for the first time in history?
Well, given that it's never happened before, I think maybe some may be skeptical, but lawmakers aren't taking anything to chance. We've heard some of them even come out to say that they have to do what it is necessary in terms of getting this addressed. We've heard from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who's talked about the ramifications if the country were to default, meaning higher interest rates for many Americans. Many won't get paid. And that is certainly something that lawmakers want to prevent. It's why we're going to see this mad dash to the finish line, if you will, to try to talk about what they're going to do in terms of raising the debt ceiling, whether Democrats have to go alone or not. And I think that something else that would be interesting that you have to think about here is what potentially would happen if the country were to go into default. And yeah, we're still in the midst of a pandemic. Although White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that a lot of health departments are exempt from what potentially happens from a shutdown and what would happen if the country were to go into default, there still are significant ramifications for those who need certain help in the midst of the pandemic as well. And so I think that is a whole other crisis that I think that many lawmakers don't really want to have to deal with. And so I think you're going to start to see a lot of people buckle down within these next few days to try to get something done.
On another topic, Sarah, earlier today, the White House again addressed images of Border Patrol agents on horseback forcefully blocking migrants. Let's listen.
There is a reason that these horse patrols have been in place and continue to be in place in some parts across the country. Of course, our Department of Homeland Security will continue to look at and assess, especially as the investigation concludes, what that looks like. They've been suspended in Del Rio, Texas. That was a step in response, of course, directly to those horrific photos. But beyond that, I think it's important to note that, as the Secretary said, the vast majority of the Border Patrol and the Horse Patrol are doing their job, and they're doing their job effectively.
Over the weekend, the U.S. expelled over 1,000 Haitians using Title 42. How do the Biden administration's immigration practices, their characterization of the situation in Del Rio, actually match up with the facts on the ground?
I think what we're starting to see from this border crisis, and also what we saw in Afghanistan, is really a standard playbook for the way the Biden administration has handled these controversies. In both situations, they were really stuck to a broad set of values that they've been putting out there on repeat and really trying to obscure the fine print of what's happening on the ground. So in Afghanistan, when we saw this playbook in use, we heard Biden administration officials saying over and over again that the priority was ending the forever war, bringing the troops home, not really addressing criticisms of what was actually happening. And that's what we're seeing with Del Rio, right? We're seeing Biden administration officials continuing to talk about the values that supposedly drive their immigration agenda, but not really addressing criticisms of the way that this has been handled, about the fact that, for example, Title 42, as you mentioned, has been really inconsistently applied. You mentioned that there is about 1,000, 2,000 Haitians who have been removed under this public health authority, but at least 12,000 more have been released into the U.S. with no clear explanation from the Biden administration of why those public health restrictions wouldn't apply to those migrants either. And you've heard Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas continue to defend the security protocol at the border, saying that it is no less secure than before Biden took office, even though we're seeing 2-decade highs in illegal border crossings. So really inconsistent message from the Biden administration. I think the fact that the handling of the immigration crisis has managed to upset both conservatives because of the number of migrants being released into the U.S. and Democrats because of the number of deportations really shows that the Biden administration doesn't have a coherent immigration policy and really didn't have a consistently applied plan to deal with all of this, because really there is no constituency that is satisfied with the way the Biden administration has handled this.
Yeah, and we've heard now those Democrats who might have been reluctant early on in the administration really speak up with this latest situation that's developed in Del Rio. You mentioned Afghanistan a moment ago, Sarah. Today, the State Department announced roughly 100 U.S. citizens and permanent residents are ready to leave Kabul. Now, you've spoken with the organizers of charter flights out of Afghanistan. What are they telling you?
Right. I mean, these organizers were really desperate to get any sort of help getting off their planes, getting their planes off the ground in northern Afghanistan, where they had organized some to get volunteers and participants of their nonprofit organizations out of the country. And they were really appalled by the lack of support from the State Department about the way that Secretary of State Antony Blinken and other top administration officials were talking about the situation, because it didn't really match what was happening on the ground. I mean, these private citizens, in many cases, have been left to fend for themselves when it comes to getting out of the country, with no diplomatic support left in the country, no military assistance available for getting people out, and the Taliban really consolidating control in aggressive ways that the U.S. initially said we weren't expected to see. And yet it's been barely a month since we've gotten out of the country, and we're already starting to see some of that brutality return and some of that lack of cooperation with the U.S. Now, the number of Americans trapped in Afghanistan seems to change all the time. The State Department, again, like we've seen with the situation in Del Rio, has really obscured the numbers here and the details of how they plan to help these Americans get out, in favor of really pushing this broad line about the necessity of getting out of Afghanistan. It's still unclear how the State Department expects to evacuate those Americans and those Afghan allies who are waiting for help. And so that is an ongoing situation, even though the political fallout here at home is less acute now.
All right, Skyler Henry, Natalie Jennings, and Sarah Westwood, thank you all very much.